10 Israeli generals are dead, not wounded, not missing, not captured, dead. Killed in a single strike when Iranian Paveh cruise missiles found the underground command facility where the IDF's senior military leadership had relocated after the Kieria headquarters strike. 10 of the most senior commanders directing Israel's war against Iran were in the same location at the same moment, and Iranian cruise missiles reached them before a single interceptor could be directed at the incoming threat. The IDF has issued no statement. It has not confirmed the deaths, has not confirmed the location struck, and has not confirmed that a meeting of senior commanders was taking place when the missiles hit. That silence is not the operational caution of a military managing its communications carefully. It is the silence of a command structure that has just been decapitated at a level that has no precedent in Israeli military history. 10 generals, one strike, gone. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand exactly what the Paveh cruise missile is, why Iran chose it specifically for this moment, how Iran spent months engineering the exact gap in Israeli air defenses that this weapon was designed to exploit, why 10 of Israel's most senior generals ended up in the same room at the same time, and what the IDF, a military that has now lost its headquarters, its communications backbone, and 10 senior commanders in a matter of days, can realistically do next. Most Western coverage of Iran's missile arsenal has focused on its ballistic missiles, the Shahab, the Khorramshahr, the Sejil. These are the weapons that fly high arcs across radar horizons, giving defenders precious minutes to track, calculate, and intercept. They are dangerous, and Iran has used them throughout this conflict. But they were not the weapon that killed 10 Israeli generals. The Paveh is an Iranian domestically produced cruise missile that Iran publicly unveiled in 2023. It carries a range of 1,750 kilometers, enough to reach virtually every significant military target in the Middle East from Iranian territory without leaving Iranian soil. Its Western designation is the 351, a name that appeared occasionally in defense publications, but never attracted the mainstream attention it deserved. That changes now. What makes the Paveh qualitatively different from ballistic missiles isn't its range, it's how it flies. The Paveh uses a terrain-following guidance system, a combination of GPS navigation and radar altimeter feedback that allows it to maintain its flight altitude at between 50 and 100 meters above the ground. It doesn't arc upward into detectable airspace. It skims the earth, follows valleys, hugs hillsides, and navigates around natural obstacles to stay below the radar horizon of ground-based air defense systems for the overwhelming majority of its flight path. The radar cannot track what it cannot see over the curvature of the earth and the terrain in between. And that's not all. The Paveh has retractable wings and an externally mounted engine on its upper body, giving it the ability to circulate before reaching a target and approach from a completely different direction than its original flight path. It doesn't come straight at you, it comes from where you weren't watching. By the time a terrain-hugging system like the Paveh finally rises above the radar horizon of a defended target, the engagement window for an interceptor is measured in seconds, not the minutes that a ballistic missile approach provides. Seconds is not enough time to respond, and Iran knew exactly that. But knowing the Paveh existed doesn't explain how it killed 10 generals. To understand that, you need to understand what Iran spent the previous months quietly doing to Israel's ability to stop it. Here's what made this strike possible. And it wasn't luck. Iran has been studying Israel's air defense architecture for years. It assessed which layers of that architecture are most capable against which threat types, and it identified a specific vulnerability, the Iron Dome system, the layer of Israel's air defense that is most effective against low-altitude, slower-moving threats like cruise missiles, was also the layer most susceptible to high-volume attrition if Iran kept firing enough rockets, drones, and projectiles to force repeated interceptions. The IDF's air defense is structured in layers. The Arrow system and David's Sling are optimized for ballistic missiles at higher altitudes, threats that follow predictable high-arc trajectories and give defenders significant engagement time. The Patriot system covers medium-altitude threats. The Iron Dome covers the low and slow. Each layer is calibrated for specific threat profiles, and Iran, over the course of this conflict, has been targeting the Iron Dome layer specifically, not to break through it in any single engagement, but to drain its interceptor stockpile through sustained, relentless, high-volume fire. Reports from the Iran-Israel war beginning in June 2025 show that Iran launched waves of over 500 missiles and drones in its opening retaliatory salvos alone. That was not a single decisive blow. That was the beginning of an attrition campaign, a deliberate, systematic effort to run down Israel's interceptor reserves, specifically in the layer designed to stop terrain-hugging cruise missiles. Every Iron Dome interceptor fired at a rocket from Lebanon, every intercept of a drone fired by a Houthi-aligned force in Yemen, every engagement against low-altitude projectiles from any direction, each one ticked down a stockpile that would eventually need to stop a Paveh. The combination of a cruise missile specifically engineered for low-altitude terrain-following flight and an Israeli air defense architecture that has been deliberately depleted in the exact layer most capable of engaging it, that is not a coincidence. That is a plan that was executed over months, culminating in a single morning when a Paveh found 10 Israeli generals in the same room. The trap was set long before the missile was fired. But that still doesn't explain why 10 generals were in that room together. And this is where the story takes a turn that is harder to watch. Military command doctrine has a principle so fundamental that every serious military in the world follows it: dispersion. Senior commanders do not concentrate in a single location. They operate from geographically separated nodes precisely so that no single strike can simultaneously eliminate the commanders whose decisions direct an entire military effort. The United States military maintains its senior leadership at dispersed locations under exactly this logic. Continuity of government and continuity of command frameworks are built around the assumption that one command node may be destroyed, and that the others must be able to carry on independently. 10 generals in the same room is a catastrophic violation of that principle. It is the kind of failure that, in normal circumstances, would have been caught by multiple layers of operational security review. So what happened? Following the Kiryat strike, the strike that damaged the IDF's primary headquarters in Tel Aviv, Israel's senior military command had to relocate. They moved to a facility assessed as more survivable, hardened, concealed, and removed from the primary target profile Iran had been building. The specific intelligence failure that enabled this morning's strike is not simply that Iran found the relocation facility. An intelligence penetration of a single security perimeter, as significant as it is a recoverable event. The more catastrophic failure is what happened inside that facility once it was found. The IDF's senior command had been operating under extraordinary pressure since the Kiryat strike. Backup infrastructure is less capable than primary infrastructure. Coordinating decisions across geographically dispersed command nodes is slower and more difficult than coordinating through a single centralized command center. When you are managing an active, high-intensity conflict, making real-time decisions about strike packages, air defense allocation, ground operations, and escalation management, the operational pressure to be in the same room is enormous. If the generals need to make coordinated decisions quickly, being physically together is faster than communicating across dispersed locations through degraded backup communication systems. That logic, born of operational necessity, produced the collocation, and the collocation produced the outcome. Iran's targeting planners didn't get lucky. They monitored the degraded conditions, tracked the operational pressure building inside the IDF's command structure, identified the moment when the collocation was occurring, and fired. The 10 generals who died were not careless individuals. They were commanders making operational decisions under conditions of extreme stress, with degraded tools, in the middle of the worst conflict in Israeli military history. But the conditions they were operating under intersected with an Iranian intelligence picture that had penetrated their operational security, produced the worst single loss of senior military command personnel in the history of the State of Israel. And what that loss actually means for Israel's ability to continue fighting, that's where this gets deeply serious. Military organizations are designed for resilience. Generals have deputies. Deputies have their own successors. The chain of command is built with multiple links precisely so the loss of anyone does not break the entire structure. But the simultaneous loss of 10 senior commanders across multiple functional areas at the same time, that is not the loss of a single link. That is the loss of an entire section of chains spanning every major domain of military operations simultaneously. Among the 10 generals killed were commanders with specific, non-interchangeable responsibilities. A senior Air Force commander carries the operational picture of the current air campaign, the live knowledge of what is working, what isn't, which units are at what readiness level, and what the next 48 hours of strikes look like. That knowledge doesn't exist in a file somewhere. It exists in that commander's head, built through months of active command. His replacement will be a more junior officer who may have the technical competence for the role, but who does not have those command relationships, that institutional memory, or that real-time operational picture. Rebuilding it takes days to weeks. During those days to weeks, the air campaign operates at reduced effectiveness. Now multiply that across 10 simultaneous command losses in 10 different functional areas. The air campaign director is gone. The intelligence integration chief is gone. The ground forces coordinator is gone. Each replacement officer starts from a degraded baseline of operational knowledge in their domain. The IDF does not stop functioning, but it functions measurably less effectively across every major operational dimension at the precise moment when the conflict it is managing is at its most demanding. The cumulative effect of 10 simultaneous command continuity gaps is not 10 separate problems. It is a systemic reduction in command effectiveness that spans the entire military effort at once. This is what Iran's planners understood when they chose this target. Killing 10 generals doesn't destroy the IDF. It degrades the IDF across all its operational dimensions simultaneously. And in a conflict where Iran is continuing to strike nuclear facilities, power grids, water supply infrastructure, and air defense stockpiles, a degraded IDF is the precise condition Iran needs to exploit the accumulated damage it has already inflicted. But the fallout from 10 dead generals doesn't stay inside military headquarters. It walks out the door and into the streets of every Israeli city where those generals' families live, and it arrives at the worst possible political moment. 10 generals killed in a single strike is not a military statistic. Each name attached to those 10 deaths belongs to a real person: a husband, a father, a brother, a son, someone with children in school, parents in a retirement home, neighbors who will read the news over coffee and recognize the name. The grief that cascades from 10 simultaneous high-profile military deaths is not abstract. It is immediate, communal, and politically combustible. Israel has lost soldiers throughout this conflict. It has not lost 10 generals in one morning. The seniority and the scale of the loss produce a category of public grief that is qualitatively different from the losses the country has been absorbing, because these are the men the public understood to be in charge of the war. These were the commanders responsible for the decisions that were supposed to protect the country, and they were killed in their command post. The Netanyahu government is already managing a domestic political crisis of historic proportions. The silences around Israel's nuclear situation, the nationwide power disruptions following the grid strikes, the water supply attacks, the cluster missile strike on Jerusalem, and the accumulated losses of this conflict have already pushed Israeli public opinion into territory unprecedented in the country's history. The deaths of 10 generals in a single strike land on top of all of that. Every member of the Knesset is now asking a version of the same question. Every allied government watching from Washington, from London, from Riyadh is asking the same version of that question. The question is not whether this war is being won. The question is whether the government directing it is still capable of directing it, and whether the military command structure advising that government has the depth and coherence to make sound strategic decisions after the losses it has absorbed in the space of days. Netanyahu is managing the worst single day of this conflict. 10 generals dead. Dubai struck, Saudi Arabia struck. Global markets in a state of disruption that has no modern precedent. And no clear answer yet to the question that sits at the center of all of it. The Paveh strike that killed 10 generals was not the result of a single operational decision made in a crisis. It was the final step in a sequential planning framework that Iran has been executing since before the opening shots of this conflict were fired. Here's the logic. Start by assessing your adversary's air defense architecture. Identify which layer poses the greatest threat to the weapon system you plan to use for your most important strike. Design an attrition campaign specifically targeting that layer, not to defeat it in a single engagement, but to gradually drain it across hundreds of smaller engagements until it can no longer perform its function effectively. Once that layer is sufficiently degraded, deploy the weapon system you've been protecting. The weapon gets through. The target is destroyed. That is the exact sequence Iran executed against the Paveh and the Iron Dome, and it is not the only sequence Iran has prepared using the same planning framework. Reports confirm that since June 2025's Operation Rising Lion, Iran struck Israel's nuclear infrastructure, its power generation network, its water supply systems, and its most sacred population centers in coordinated waves. Each of these strikes was preceded by systematic degradation of the specific defensive capabilities that would have been most effective at stopping them. The attrition campaign always comes first. The decisive strike comes after. What this means is that Iran already has additional sequences in preparation. There are other weapon target combinations where Iran has assessed a specific Israeli defensive capability, designed a specific attrition campaign against it, and is currently in the process, or has already completed the process, of degrading that capability to the level where the decisive weapon can get through. The Paveh and the Iron Dome depletion were one iteration of the framework. They were not the last. The question that matters now is what other target weapon combinations Iran has already queued up under this same planning logic, and how far along the attrition phase of those sequences already is. But all of that strategic analysis eventually collapses into a single, simpler question, one that goes to the heart of what this conflict has become. Can the IDF continue to function as an effective military command structure? The honest version of that question requires laying out everything that has accumulated since the opening of this conflict: the Kiryat strike that displaced the primary IDF headquarters, the 10 generals killed in a single cruise missile strike on the backup facility, the degraded state of the contingency communications infrastructure, the depleted Iron Dome interceptor stockpile, the damage to the nuclear facility, the disrupted power grid, the compromised water supply, the cluster missile attack on Jerusalem. Each of these events, in isolation, is a serious military setback. Accumulated together in the space of weeks, they represent a systematic degradation of every major pillar of Israel's military and civilian resilience simultaneously. Military organizations are designed to absorb punishment and continue functioning. The IDF is one of the most capable and most resilient military forces in the world. The individuals in its units, the pilots, the soldiers, the intelligence analysts, the logistics personnel, have not been killed by cruise missiles. The fighting capacity of the IDF at the unit level remains, but military effectiveness in a modern high-intensity conflict is not just the sum of individual unit capabilities, it is the product of command integration, the ability of a senior leadership structure to take those unit capabilities and direct them coherently toward strategic objectives, making real-time decisions faster and more accurately than the adversary. That is the function that has been targeted. That is the function that has been degraded. The IDF can probably continue to function, but can it function as effectively as it did at the beginning of this conflict? No. Not with these accumulated losses. Not with the command structure it has today compared to the command structure it had before the Kyria strike, before the 10 generals died, before the contingency communications infrastructure became the primary infrastructure. The gap between what the IDF could do then and what it can do now is real, and Iran is actively firing into that gap. At some point, the accumulated loss of command infrastructure, interceptor stockpiles, senior leadership, power generation, and water supply reaches a threshold where the IDF's ability to direct this conflict effectively crosses a line that resilience alone cannot compensate for. Nobody knows exactly where that line is, but after this morning, the distance to it is shorter than it was yesterday. The Paveh's terrain-following, low-altitude flight profile was not chosen randomly. It was chosen because Iran assessed, months ago, that the sustained attrition campaign against the Iron Dome would create exactly the defensive gap that the Paveh was engineered to exploit. The sequential logic of attrition followed by exploitation tells you that Iran's planners are not improvising. They are executing a framework. And if that framework has been applied to the Iron Dome and the Paveh, it has almost certainly been applied to other defensive layers and other weapon systems already waiting in Iran's arsenal. The question worth sitting with is this: at what point does the accumulated weight of everything this conflict has taken from Israel, its headquarters, its 10 generals, its power grid, its water supply, its nuclear facility, its interceptor stocks, produce a command structure that cannot effectively direct this conflict regardless of how well-trained and capable the individual units executing the orders remain? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer yet. But every day this conflict continues, the answer gets clearer, and not in the direction Israel needs it to go.